This is Aging Forward, a podcast from Mayo Clinic about the science behind healthy aging and longevity. Each episode, we explore new ways to take care of our long-term health, the health of our loved ones, and our community, so we can all live longer and better. I'm Dr. Christina Chen, a geriatrician and internist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And this episode, we are talking about aging as it affects older women. So women experience different health challenges than men as we age, including the after effects of menopause and generally experiencing a longer life, which means that in later years, many women age alone. So how else is aging different for women, and what can they do to increase their health span, brain span, and lifespan? Today, I am delighted to introduce our guest, Maddy Dychtwald, who is such a strong presence in the healthy aging, longevity, and women's empowerment space. She is the co-founder of AgeWave, which has helped lead industries and companies to understand the key trends impacting the aging population. She is a well-known keynote speaker and author of the newly released book, Ageless Aging, which I actually had the pleasure of medically reviewing. So welcome, Maddy, to the Aging Forward podcast.
Great to be here with you.
You know, there's just so many books out there nowadays on healthy aging, ones that are more scientific focused. There's ones that highlight key components like lifestyle and diet. There's a whole longevity trend. And what I really appreciate about Ageless Aging is that it has just enough of the scientific explanations, but it really highlights those core pillars of healthy aging that I try to do as much as possible in my clinic visits. And most of all, it speaks to women. So thank you for your work on that.
Thank you for saying that.
And most of our guests are clinicians. It's really nice to have a different voice, a different perspective. Can you share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the aging space and what led you to writing this book?
I am a co-founder of AgeWave. My husband and I founded AgeWave back in 1986. And literally, we started it at our kitchen table. We were interested in the demographic changes that we saw happening in terms of the aging of our populations. What we saw happening was fewer babies, more older people. And at the time, there seemed to be a real prejudice against people over the age of 50. Literally, 50 was the marker of over the hill. And we were like, whoa, if people are living longer and at 50, they're considered over the hill, and marketers are not trying to reach out to them, health practitioners are all but ignoring them. What's that about? So my husband and I decided that we were going to go out there and try to change the image of what aging was like. And that's how I started, really. And along the way, we've built up this network of experts because I'm not a doctor and I'm not a researcher at the cutting edge, but I have access to the top experts, doctors, academics. And I also got older. I started doing this when I was in my 30s. I'm now 75 years old. And
You are not.
yeah.
Oh, my goodness. You look amazing, Maddy.
Well,
Wow.
thank you. Thank you. You know, following this ageless aging recipe, really.
Right.
But along the way, I did realize I had the direct experience of the fact that aging, it's a lot like playing dodgeball. We are dodging health and emotional and personal crises along the way. And frankly, it helps us build resilience. But it also made me realize that I think we have more control over how we age than we've been led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like a huge aha for me because I was under the scientific impression that 70% of our health and well-being had to do with our genetics.
Mm-hmm.
And then I discovered through some of the experts I interacted with that that scientific fact has been turned on its head. And the narrative on aging has really shifted. Today, according to the most recent science, we know that up to 90% of our health and well-being has to do with our lifestyle and environment. Mm-hmm. So we're literally the CEOs of our own health.
That's true.
We're in charge. For some people, that's like, oh my God, that's really scary. And for other people, it's totally empowering. So that's part of why I wrote Ageless Aging, to make it more empowering, especially for women.
Maddy, you wanted to share this book specifically for women in the aging journey because we experience it so differently. Can you tell us more about that?
When I looked into the marketplace of books, for instance, and information that was being put out there by scientists and physicians, I saw that much of it was aimed either at a very general audience or specifically at men.
Mm-hmm.
And these books were primarily written by men. And I'm like, well, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And what I began to see, and Christy, I know you're well aware of this as a physician, the whole healthcare system, which is well-meaning, it's a well-meaning system, but it has been primarily designed for men by men. And honestly, we think of women's health as being reproductive health. It wasn't even until 1993 that clinicians began to include some women in later stage clinical trials. And it wasn't until even more recently, 2016, that the FDA stepped in and said, you really ought to include women in clinical trials. So that means that much of the medicine that we're taking, it's not even designed for women. So that concerns me because let's be honest about it. Women, we've won the longevity lottery because we live an average of 5 to 6 years longer than men. But there is that health gender paradox that, women, our lifespans are longer, but when it comes to our health spans and our brain spans, we're not doing as well as men. In fact, we spend the last 12 to 14 years of our life on average in a cascade of poor health. Things like frailty, osteoporosis, heart disease, lung disease, and the worst of all, Alzheimer's disease.
It's really interesting you mentioned that because I also notice it from a clinician perspective. There's certain health topics, for example, that women are just not comfortable talking about because they feel like I shouldn't talk about it, or that's something I should just live with because it's supposed to be that way. Perimenopausal symptoms, for example, sexual health, mental health, and emotional health. But it's changing now because I think providers are also more open about asking these questions and having these conversations with women. You mentioned that you've been in the space since 1984. That's when you founded Age
1986.
1986. Okay. Well, I was 4 years old.
Oh my God. You see, I tell people all the time, I've probably been in this field longer than you've been alive.
Yeah. So I'm really curious, how have you noticed aging trends have changed since then? You mentioned a little bit of that earlier, but in terms of the industry itself and our attitudes towards aging just as a whole, what have you noticed?
Well, I've noticed that I've wished it would change more than it has, for one thing. But I do think that the marker of what is old has actually morphed. And we're beginning to see some role models in our culture of what it means to age well. Mostly they're famous people. Like we see someone like Dolly Parton, who is probably one of the most awesome people out there. And, she said, look, aging, it's a number, and I don't think about it. I don't have time to think about it.
Yeah.
Rita Moreno in her 90s. And I got to say, if that's what 92 looks like, sign me up. Because she's not just looks good, but her brain is clear and she moves beautifully. I mean, she's a great exemplar of what is possible.
Yeah. When I look online of just what aging looks like, it's less and less of people in wheelchairs and walkers and disabled, poor health. And I'm seeing a lot more push towards vibrancy and activity and just being socially engaged even into our 80s and 90s. So I do like that we're trying to influence it in that direction of living longer, but also living healthier, right? And so that kind of goes to my next few questions. The difference between lifespan and healthspan. I feel like healthspan is a fairly newer concept where it's different than how long we live.
Lifespan is the number of years that you live. So it's your life expectancy. Healthspan is the number of healthy years that you live.
Right.
So if you're like in a cascade of negative health, even if it's just aches and pains, you're not living your best life. And then brain span is the ultimate factor that's affecting people today. And that is the number of healthy years that your brain is functioning. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
third of all people over the age of 85, women and men, have some form of cognitive decline.
And that's so scary. Yeah, that is just,
It is scary.
you mentioned earlier, in women, we tend to live longer.
Yeah.
There's physiologic aspects to that, but there's also social aspects to that. Why do we live longer as women?
First, the science is not clear exactly why women live longer than men, but in fact, we do. Many scientists will tell you that it has to do with estrogen. Estrogen acts as a protective thing in your body, protecting not just your reproductive system, but your brain, your organs, everything. So you get an extra 10 years. So just as an example, women, their number one disease that they die of is heart disease, but
Mm-hmm.
we don't get it until 10 years later than men because we have the protective quality of estrogen in our system. It's interesting because women in general are more social beings than men, and we know that loneliness itself is more prone in younger people right now and
Mm-hmm.
the very old, especially women. And that's a little scary because we know that loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
You know, this whole idea of social fitness is the real deal. It's not just a nice to have, it's a got to have. And it's something that we all need to think about, women and men.
Mm-hmm.
But especially as women get older, since we outlive men and since so many who are in the older years right now tend to marry men a little bit older than them, they often end up being solo agers.
Yeah.
And if they're aging alone, they need to come up with a plan. You really need to think through, how do you add social connection into your life in a proactive way?
Mm-hmm. The other observation I made was that when the spouse passes away, the widow can live actually a little bit longer. But if the wife passes away first, it's very short afterwards where the male passes away afterward. It could be like a couple months to a
Or
couple
gets
years.
remarried.
Right, right. There's that caregiving aspect. When we have the purpose of caregiving for other people, it builds up that resilience in many ways. What are the health benefits of feeling useful and purposeful in our life, and how that fits into the social fitness aspect?
I think that the social connection and purpose have really started to gain some traction from a cultural standpoint these days. Chip Conley, he created Modern Elder Academy, and he said it to me brilliantly. I relates to illness, we relates to wellness.
I
The
love that.
whole idea that we are social creatures and we benefit from interacting with other people. And we saw the impact during COVID of not doing that. We did studies at AgeWave during COVID, and what we found was that the younger people in particular were really suffering.
Hmm.
And then many older people, especially those who were confined to their homes, they really suffered too, more than you would expect. Whereas people in the middle didn't suffer quite as much because they were still working and they were meeting with people via Zoom. But it's a real challenge. And one of the people that I spoke to, a psychology professor at Columbia University, and she told me that even having these micro connections
Hmm.
were really important. So, for instance, let's say you just leave your house and you go to Starbucks or some coffee place for breakfast in the morning, and you interact with the barista and they start to know your name and you know
Mm-hmm.
their name and you like maybe say more than a few words. That's considered a micro communication connection. Same thing if you go to the grocery store, go to Whole Foods or Safeway or wherever you go, your local market, having a connection with that cashier. Believe it or not, those things add up.
That's true. Now that I think about it, I feel like the most interesting conversations I've ever had are the ones on airplanes next to random strangers. And I remember every person that I've talked to on the airplane because their story is so new and so interesting. And it's like, wow, that's a human that I just had a connection with. My next question is, you've identified a long list of behaviors that are either age accelerants or what you call age deterrents. We talked about a few here, but can you give us a few more examples?
So going a day or more without exercising is a way to accelerate your aging. On the flip side of it is if you get at least 30 minutes of some kind of exercise, strengthening of muscles being the best, 3 to 5 times a week, 5 to 7 times a week in my mind, that means that you are chipping away at aging poorly. Smoking will accelerate your aging. So will drinking alcohol. We used to think, oh, just drink one alcoholic beverage a day. Now they're telling us that drinking any alcohol can actually increase your risk of cancer. And that's relatively new studies. So that's kind of a bummer, right?
Yeah.
Sitting is the new smoking. If you sit for more than 3 hours without getting up, that's going to accelerate your aging. So on the flip side, if you stand up or get up out of your seat every hour or two, that's going to help you age a little bit better.
Just got to keep physically moving.
Yeah. I personally think that if there were a silver bullet, it would be fitness.
Yeah.
Skipping brushing your teeth, that accelerates your aging because there's bacteria in your mouth that can actually make its way up to your brain and contribute to amyloid building up in your brain, which is one of the contributors to cognitive decline. Eating sugar, eating ultra-processed foods, these are all going to accelerate your aging. Whereas on the flip side, what's going to make you age better is to eat a lot of greens and organic foods. Hydration. You want to stay hydrated, and that will help you to live better longer. And I think on my website, we have a list of the accelerants and the decelerants so that you can look at them and say, oh, I do all this right. That's great news. And here's places I can improve. And that's what it's about, I think. One of the Mayo Clinic physicians I spoke to was Dr. Stephen Kopecki. And he said, find one place. Maybe it's food, maybe it's fitness, maybe it's social connection where you can get started and see some changes take place. And that's going to motivate you to make changes in other areas.
I love that. And then you did mention another tip that we may not be as familiar with on how to age more healthily. And one of them is understanding your own age identity. Can you explain that a little bit more and what that means?
Christy, I love this one. First of all, I practice it. It's called the positivity effect. And the research that has been done on this was begun by Dr. Becca Levy from Yale. And she went into the Midwest and studied people and their attitudes towards aging. And what she found, which is pretty remarkable, was that those of us who have a more positive attitude towards our own aging and others' aging, we lived an average of 7.5 years longer than those who had a negative attitude. But more research has been done since then, and they found that having a positive attitude towards aging, it can actually reduce your risk of heart disease by 40% and cognitive decline by 40%. Now, that's motivating.
That's amazing.
Especially since changing your attitude, it doesn't cost a penny.
I feel like it's hard to do, though. You know, it can be really overwhelming sometimes to make a complete change in your life. And I know in your book, you outline very specific things that we can do to take care of our bodies and minds. And maybe by doing that first, the change in mindset can then come later as a result. Can you tell us more of the concrete advice you give for how to age well?
You know, things like diet, that's no shock. Sleep, not a shock. But as we've been talking about, social connection and purpose and brain health, these things don't exist in silos. They actually interact with one another. So, for instance, if you're exercising on a regular basis, you're going to have more energy to do the things like connect with friends and family and maybe have a sense of purpose. And By the way, having a sense of purpose, people go, oh my God, what do I have to start a nonprofit or go
Right.
back to work? And no, it could be walking your dog or taking care of your grandkids. It can be small things that
Right.
make you feel like you have a reason to get up in the morning.
Yeah. When you mentioned that recipe, it reminds me of the blue zones and
Yeah,
how everyone in those small population areas, they're all aging well and they're doing something different in each zone, but it's all kind of the same concept.
absolutely. And that's built into their life. That's what makes it easier because
Right.
they have a community of like minded people.
Let's focus on some practical tips we can share with our listeners about the lifestyle and environment piece. We've had one conversation earlier with a fitness coach about the strength training piece, but you mentioned there's 6 essential types of movement and exercise.
Just to add a little bit of a pinpoint to the muscle strength building, it's the most important part as you get older because you want to fight sarcopenia, which is
Mhm.
the loss of muscle mass. And that can begin as early as in your 30s. So that's one kind. Cardio is another really important kind. We want to build endurance, our ability to walk, run, be able to compete from a cardiovascular perspective. Then there's flexibility. You want to remain flexible. Doing yoga is a really good thing. I try to do that at least 3 to 5 times a week. I do it in my own home. Four is balance. And
Yes.
I personally think balance is super important because if you're not balanced, you could fall and
Mhm.
break a hip or really hurt yourself, and that's going to put you out of commission. I practice my balance through Pilates, and I find myself getting better and better, which is great news. You want to see improvement. The next one is posture and functional capacity. I actually think this is becoming more and more important as we spend more time in front of our computers, leaning over, putting our head forward. It's a big concern. And then the last, which is the best kind for many people, is the relaxation and breathing. And I don't want to underestimate it. I mean, it sounds like, oh, yeah, just go take a little chill pill. But meditation would fall under that category, breathing exercises. And I know for me in my own personal life, I fall asleep by doing breathing exercises. When I prep for a keynote speech, I do the boxed breathing. It just really calms me down and makes me feel energized. There's all kinds of apps that are available. Practicing gratitude actually would fall into that category. Keeping a gratitude journal. There's so many things that fall into this relaxation and breathing that are important. So those are the 6 kinds.
Yeah. I love that you bring in ones that aren't typically thought about. The relaxation breathing and stretching is something that people forget to do, and they try to go into heavy cardio strength training without getting their muscles prepared. And then that's injury prone. That's the risk of damage to the
Yeah.
muscles and ligaments and tendons. And so I'm really glad that we're looking at this as a whole. As times change, as our bodies change, we can't be doing things that 20-year-olds are doing. And maybe some of us still can, but we really have to focus on the restoration piece and the preparation piece as well.
I think that you're 100% right. Aging is a lifelong process, and
Hmm.
we begin it at birth and we go all the way till we die. And what we're beginning to see because of the lifestyle and environmental challenges that many people are trying to fight, I guess you would say, through our choices that we make on a daily basis. Many of us are doing great in our
Hmm.
70s and our 80s and beyond.
So let's talk about Brainspan. I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about this because my area of passion is cognitive health, and a lot of my work is in dementia care because, we still don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease yet, despite knowing about it for almost 120 years. And so what we as individuals can focus really on is prevention, right? My spiel for people is a happy brain makes for a happy body. An unhappy brain is a dysfunctional brain that then leads to a dysfunctional body. So I think we have, general awareness that we have to have healthy sleep and good emotional health and all these things, but there's a lot of other things that people may be less aware of, which you do mention in your book.
You're 100% right. And the prevention piece is relatively new. I have Alzheimer's running in my family. My
Ah,
mom had it. We threw her a party for her 85th birthday, and she loved it. She had the best time. And the next morning, we sat down to talk about it, and she didn't remember it.
oh,
I know, it's heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. But the genetic side of it has been lessened in the minds of scientists and experts like yourself, whereas the preventative side of it has grown in importance. And, one of the shortcuts I think about is what's good for your heart is good for your brain.
mm,
I recently had the great pleasure of running into Dr. Rudy Tanti, who is one of the foremost experts on Alzheimer's research. He told me that the most recent science is far different than what we used to think it was, because we've always associated amyloid and tau, but we've also known that in certain instances when we've looked at the brains of people who are no longer alive, some of whom have had Alzheimer's and some haven't, some of the ones who have had Alzheimer's had no amyloid in their brain, and others who had a lot of it in their brain had no symptoms of Alzheimer's.
And so for our listeners, buildup of amyloid and tau is really a key feature for Alzheimer's. So this is very surprising.
So what he told me was, yes, you need to have amyloid and tau, but what really makes cognitive decline and Alzheimer's in particular happen has to do with the fact of neuroinflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I really do find interesting is vagus nerve stimulation.
Mm.
So we know the vagus nerve goes all the way from your brain stem all the way down to your gut, and that's considered the gut-brain highway. And stimulating your vagus nerve in a variety of different ways, it really calms the body and the brain down. And what's so great about that is that if you have trouble sleeping, for instance, using some kind of a vagus nerve stimulator can actually make a huge difference, especially if what's going on for you is that your brain doesn't feel like it's shutting off.
Never shuts off when it's supposed
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, so there's some aromatherapy treatments that work. And when I use the word treatment, I'm using it in a very general way. But I personally find that the aroma of lavender stimulates my brain in such a way that it makes me relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a vagus nerve reaction. I think that that's pretty cool. Audio therapy has become really popular.
Is that like music therapy?
It's music and sound. Sometimes
Uh-huh.
it's just the sounds or the beats that can actually stimulate your brain in new ways.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar. Some people use the tapping method, that they feel like you tap certain areas of your head and neck, and it works the same kind of way. Light therapy, the same thing. I have one of those 40 megahertz lights in my office that
Mm-hmm.
if I put it on every day, which I don't, but if I were to do that, supposedly it detoxes your brain. That's a good thing. That's what sleep does, by the way. Sleep is the opportunity to not just rest, but to repair.
Right, right. Some of the research that I do is on circadian lighting therapy for persons with early cognitive impairment, because it's not just morning lighting, what they call seasonal affective disorder, right? It's all day that the lighting changes to mimic the movement of the sun, to see if that helps resynchronize the brain melatonin levels and help with sleep and hopefully reduce mood-related problems. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to explore in that area.
And what you do in the morning and even during the day really impacts your sleep just as much as what you're doing at night.
Mm-hmm. Well, Maddy, I do have a few closing questions for you. It's kind of a little tradition we do on the show. We like to get to know you a little bit more. What do you personally do to age well?
I'd wake up in the morning, I just have lemon and water or water and apple cider vinegar every morning. I try to get my circadian rhythms going in the right direction by walking my dog outside when its sun first comes up. And I try to take either a Pilates class or do cardio first thing in the morning, like by 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm really influenced by something that one of the Alzheimer's researchers talked to me about. She was based in France, so she has a very French perspective on things. And she said, in France, we prioritize joy. And as important as it is to eat a healthy diet, it is also important to prioritize feeling a sense of joy and recognizing that you're feeling that joy and embracing it. And I think about that all the time. I try to embrace joy.
And our last question is actually for our listeners, just to give them something to think about as they reflect on our conversation today and how they can age well for themselves. So, Maddy, what is a question you have for our listeners to make them consider how ageless aging applies to them?
I learned 2 things from 2 really well-respected physicians, researchers, in terms of how do you implement this ageless aging holistic recipe. So Dr. Steve Kopecky over at Mayo Clinic, he told me that he suggests that people find one entry point. And I think I mentioned this earlier. So changing your diet, or maybe it's starting to exercise every day. And then from that, you're going to feel better over a matter of weeks and months, and you're going to want to go further. On the other hand, if you are struggling with a cascade of aches and pains, or maybe heart disease, or maybe you feel like your brain isn't functioning at its best, Dr. Dean Ornish told me something quite different. He said to me, no, you should take this ageless aging holistic recipe and you should implement as many of the things at once as you can, and then give yourself a month. And in that month, you are going to feel so much better. And then take the diagnostic tests, get those blood tests, ask your doctor, I want those blood tests. And when you see the results compared to what they were, it's going to motivate you to stay with it. He did add one other part. He said, and be sure to have a social network of people who can help you stay on track.
Well, this has been such a fun conversation. And I just love speaking to authors because I can tell you're so passionate about your work, and you've just been such a huge influence and pivotal figure in the space of healthy aging. So please keep doing what you're doing for as long as possible as a leader and as someone who is clearly setting an example of ageless aging. Thank you, Maddy.
Thank you, Christy. It's been such a pleasure being here with you.
So that's all for this episode. Hopefully you're feeling a little bit more informed, inspired, and empowered. For more information on Maddy's book, Ageless Aging, you can find a link in our show notes. On the next episode of Aging Forward, one of the most profound and challenging journeys in the aging experience, being a caregiver.
My mom and dad were married for more than 60 years. It wasn't until he was gone that we realized her dementia had progressed as much as it had.
I see. If you have a topic suggestion for a future episode, you can leave us a voicemail at 507-538-6272, and we might even feature your voice on the show. For more Aging Forward episodes and resources, head to mayoclinic.org/agingforward. And if you found this show helpful, please subscribe and make sure to rate and review us on your podcast app. It really helps others find our show. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious and stay active.